In every small town, there is a girl people remember not for what she dreamed of, but for what the world did to her. Tonight's story isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about the kind of forgiveness that hurts, and the quiet courage it takes to live after being broken. This is the weight of sin. You're listening to Calm Mind Journal Real Stories at Night. There are places the world forgets, quiet towns tucked between rivers and dust, where life moves in circles, and people speak softly because the air still remembers their secrets. Grace Miller was born in one of those places, a small town in Tennessee, where mornings smelled of wet soil and schoolgirls rode their bicycles past the churchyard, their white uniforms fluttering like flags of purity. Grace was the brightest of them all, 18, gentle, with a kind of beauty that wasn't loud, a beauty that felt accidental, as if she had been carved from sunlight that didn't know how to hide. Her mother sold flowers at the Sunday market. Her father fixed tractors and drank too much. And Grace dreamed not of riches, but of leaving. She wanted a city where her name meant something, where she could study medicine, help people, breathe air that didn't smell of the same rain. But the world, it rarely lets innocence leave unmarked. He came one afternoon in a black car that looked too clean for the dirt roads. His name was Richard Hayes, a businessman, a man twice her age, whose voice carried the calm of someone who had already learned how to lie without flinching. He came to the town to buy land and left with Grace's heart. At first, it was just admiration. He spoke to her as if her thoughts mattered. He asked about her books, her dreams, the way no one else ever had. And when she smiled, he looked at her the way sunlight looks through glass, as if she were both fragile and precious. In small towns, love is always seen before it's said. People noticed, the neighbors whispered, but Grace didn't care, because when you've never been loved, attention feels like salvation. They met in secret, at the old barn behind the church, under the orange glow of setting sun, where every kiss felt like confession, and every touch felt like sin dressed as tenderness. Grace believed him when he said he would leave his wife, believed him when he said he was lonely, believed him when he said she was the only light left in his life, and perhaps, in some broken way, he did believe it too. When the first blood didn't come that month, Grace sat by the window with shaking hands, holding the test that turned her future into a sentence. She whispered his name not in anger, but in disbelief, as if saying it might rewind time. Richard didn't answer her calls that night, nor the next. By the third week, the whole town knew. The whispers returned louder now, like a choir rehearsing her downfall. His wife came first, with a rage that years of silence had sharpened into precision. They dragged Grace from her house, tore her white school uniform, and left her bleeding by the gate, where children used to wave goodbye to her every morning. The world watched. No one helped, because in small towns, shame spreads faster than compassion. Her father found her that night. He didn't see a daughter. He saw disgrace. His hands, calloused from labor, became weapons of disappointment. When he struck her, the sound was not anger. It was the echo of a name dying in his throat. She lost the baby before morning. Her mother wept until her lungs gave up. And Grace, once the town's pride, became its warning. She could no longer walk. Her father's rage had broken more than her bones. And so, the girl who once dreamed of saving lives now sat by a window, watching the seasons change without her. Months passed. Winter came quietly, folding the town in gray. People forgot, as they always do. But Grace didn't. Every morning, she saw the white dress in her closet torn, stained, but still there, a relic of who she had been. She couldn't throw it away. It was her reminder that purity, once broken, doesn't disappear. It lingers like a scar under silk. Sometimes she wondered if she was being punished for wanting too much, for loving wrongly, for being human. But mostly, she wondered if God still listened to girls whose prayers had blood on them. One evening, as rain wrote its sad stories on the glass, a car stopped in front of her house. Richard stepped out, older now, tired, carrying the kind of guilt that money can't bury. Grace didn't move when he entered. Her hands were folded on her lap, her eyes empty, the kind of empty that used to hold oceans. "I came to help," he said softly. She smiled. "A ghost of what used to be." "You already did," she answered, "once." He didn't know what to do with her forgiveness. Most men don't. He offered her money, a new home in the city, a chance to start again. And Grace, with nowhere else to go, accepted, because sometimes survival wears the face of the man who ruined you. When the car left the town the next morning, people stood by their fences, pretending not to look. Grace didn't look back. She had learned that the past doesn't vanish when you stare at it. It just stares back. As the fields blurred into highways, she touched the hem of her old white dress hidden beneath her coat, and thought perhaps redemption isn't light. Perhaps it's just another shadow that follows you until you learn to forgive yourself. In the city, Grace found new walls and new silences. Austin was louder than the town that had unmade her. Even its quiet carried traffic like a second pulse. Richard moved her into a house with wide windows and a kitchen that believed in second chances. He hired a nurse for her leg, a tutor for the diploma she had abandoned, a driver who opened doors she wasn't yet ready to walk through. People called it rescue. Rescue is just control with better manners. Richard's daughters, Lena and Sophie, visited on Sundays, the way storms visit coastlines. They were beautiful in the way money is beautiful polished, reflective, a little rude. They kissed their father's cheek as if the gesture were an apology the world owed them. They looked at Grace and saw a story they didn't choose. At dinner, conversation arrived plated. "What are your plans?" Lena asked. "Slicing salmon into symmetrical regret." "Finish school," Grace said. "Work. Be useful." Sophie smiled the way glass smiles before it breaks. To whom Richard cleared his throat and said something about opportunity, timing, patience. He tried to love all his women the way one holds different keys on a ring, juggling, labeling, pretending they don't cut. In the first spring, Grace learned to walk without the cane. In the second, she learned how to move through the house without touching anything. She spoke gently to the staff. She wrote letters to a God who hadn't changed his address. At night, she sat by the upstairs landing and counted the city lights as if they were answers she could collect. Then the test turned pink again, and the silence inside her rearranged itself into awe. Richard wept, a private weeping meant for men who can still be surprised by mercy. "We'll be a family," he said. And for a week, he said nothing else. He drove more carefully. He ate fruit. He placed his palm on her stomach as if he could translate the future by warmth alone. News travels through houses the way scent does, first as rumor, then as fact. Lena's congratulations were an invoice. Sophie's smile asked whether love could be measured by wills and titles. The housekeeper, Marta, crossed herself when Grace walked by, then told the kitchen boy in Spanish that the world was complicated under rich roofs. Grace went to prenatal appointments with a hope that felt like courage in costume. She folded tiny clothes she couldn't yet justify buying. She placed them in a drawer that smelled like cedar, and imagined forgiveness folded neatly beside them. The night of the staircase. Rain had made the whole city a mirror. She had been craving mango and salt. She had also been craving belief. The second craving is always more dangerous. On the upstairs landing, just outside the nursery that was still only paint and promises, the wood was slick. She thought strange. It hasn't leaked here before. Then the world tilted. Bodies remember old pain the way dogs remember old roads. Her shoulder tried to twist away from gravity. Her hands reached for a banister that wasn't where memory left it. She fell, and the noise her body made was the kind that erases sound for a second afterward. When she opened her eyes, there was a red halo below her hip. Blood spreads like certainty fast, indifferent. Somewhere in the house, a glass broke. Somewhere else, a woman shouted a name. In the distance, a siren rehearsed the future. In the hospital, the doctor tucked bad news into careful words. "I'm sorry." Grace nodded. Sorrow had been teaching her a second language. She could understand without translation. Richard arrived and shook enough to be mistaken for sincerity. He held her hand, then released it as if her skin had become an indictment. The daughters stood in the doorway, two silhouettes that explained nothing. When they were alone, Grace searched his face for the man who promised rescue. "Did you know?" she asked. "Know what?" "That the landing was slick." "Of course not," he said, too quickly, in grief. Even ordinary footsteps sound like conspiracies. The house's silence changed after that. Doors closed softer, as if to avoid waking a memory. Marta stopped humming in the mornings. The sisters spoke in the language of inherited contempt, and Richard's late nights multiplied the way guilt does when it gets a password and a door code. You can track betrayal by its new perfumes. By the third week, Grace could smell a woman she had known for years, the citrus and cedar of Melissa Grant, the friend who had helped her leave Tennessee, the friend whose laugh had once made the city feel less sharp. Rescue becomes cruelty when it forgets its promises. Richard forgot. Melissa reminded him. One afternoon, Grace saw Melissa's reflection in the foyer. Glass hand on Richard's arm. Voice low. Eyes steady with a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. They did not see Grace see them. That night, she folded the tiny clothes she could no longer use. She placed them back in the drawer and shut it with a care that hurt. She did not scream. She learned long ago that screaming only teaches walls their strength. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is a design, a structure that holds even when the architect is trembling. Grace invited Melissa for tea. There are women who fight with noise and women who fight with chairs pulled out for their enemies. Grace had a quiet table set with lemon wedges cut too perfectly for coincidence. Melissa arrived suspicious and beautiful, carrying flowers the way soldiers carry flags. "You're pregnant," Grace said softly, as if commenting on weather no one had ordered. Melissa's mouth twitched. She had planned other entrances. How? "The body knows," Grace said, "and your perfume is brighter." They sat, two women separated by very little and everything. "If it's Richard's," Grace continued, I won't ask you to end it. I will ask you to let me raise the child if you can't. I can hold love that large. Melissa steadied her cup. You're either a saint, she said, or a strategist. Grace half smiled. Both are just women who have run out of appetites. The bargain wasn't written down. It didn't have to be. Melissa moved in 2 weeks later, at Richard's suggestion and against the daughter's rage. The house rearranged itself around the new gravity prenatal vitamins beside whiskey. Upstairs, arguments walked downstairs by other people's footsteps. Lena and Sophie chose a different kind of war. They learned the kitchen schedule, the way Marta labeled leftovers, the brand of shrimp Melissa craved. They made phone calls they couldn't spell and acquired powders they didn't understand. They were young and believed consequences were for people without fathers. The evening of the poison, the air held storm pressure. In the dining room, the chandelier threw light like a kind of threat. Marta served shrimp their favorite, Melissa's indulgence. Grace watched the sisters' hands, how they fidgeted, how their eyes flitted to the pitcher, the door, the clock. Melissa's fork paused halfway to her mouth. The air had a sweetness it shouldn't. She set the bite down, stood, and walked to the kitchen without asking permission. She found the small packet in the trash, its edges damp and damning. When she returned, she didn't yell. She set the packet between the sisters like a photograph they hoped didn't exist. Eat, she said softly, sliding the plate toward them. Sophie laughed. Brittle. You're insane. Hungry, Melissa corrected. For justice. Grace rose. The room tilting not with fear, but with mathematics. She moved between them and the dare. No one eats, she said. No one dies. Melissa's eyes flashed. They wanted. I know what they wanted, Grace said. And I know what you almost wanted to give them. We're not multiplying funerals. Richard arrived at the end of the argument, the way men often do, late and ready to adjudicate what they hadn't paid to understand. He demanded explanations. The packet told its story better than anyone. He turned to his daughters, waiting for the version where they were still children. None arrived. Privilege met consequence in the space between his eyebrows. He told them to pack small bags. He told them they had to go. They moved out that night. They slammed doors that had once opened simply because they were theirs. In the driveway, Sophie cried the cry of people who finally meet the limits of their father's money. Lena stared at the upstairs window where the nursery had once been a possibility and memorized a fury she would spend later. Inside, Grace washed dishes with hands that didn't shake. Melissa stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around a belly the world would use as leverage if it could. Why did you spare them? Melissa asked. Because I hope someone will spare us, Grace whispered. Forgiveness can be a transaction with the future. The call came 2 months later, at an hour that felt like a wound. A man's voice, dry with impatience. Victor Kane. He did not introduce himself as a prophet of violence, but he was. We have your daughters, he said to Richard. Bring the money. Come alone. Lena and Sophie had gone where abandoned privilege often goes, into the arms of men who smelled like solutions and owned nothing but guns. Victor had debts and an education in cruelty. The sisters were currency that had walked to him on its own. Richard gathered cash like confessions. He didn't tell police at first because shame negotiates badly. He didn't tell Grace because pride prefers solitude. But Grace heard the kind of silence that had geography, and she followed it. Where she asked, "Doesn't matter. It always matters," she said, and called a detective she'd once met in a hospital hallway. Quiet favors produce honest friends. They tracked him to an abandoned warehouse near the river, a place where echoes practiced being ghosts. Grace insisted on the back seat. Melissa insisted on coming, because motherhood under construction is still motherhood. The detective tailed them without promise. Inside the warehouse, men became arrangements, 3 near the door, 1 by the upper catwalk, 1 shadow that might have been a person or a story. Lena and Sophie sat bound. Mascara making roads tears had not requested. Richard approached the way people approach altars, hopeful, doomed. Money, Victor said, as if love were a method of accounting. Richard slid the duffel across the concrete. It made an ugly sound, the syllable of compromise. Things moved quickly then, as if someone had pressed fast forward on a bad dream. An argument about counting, a shove, Sophie stumbling into Victor's reach. A gun that had been sleeping decided to wake. Richard moved without thinking. Goodness sometimes does stepping between bullet and daughter with the whole of his chest. The first shot took time. The second arrived on its back. He exhaled the way men do when a lifetime makes a point and then makes another. Sophie screamed a sound she would never be able to describe. Lena forgot she hated anyone. Melissa held her belly so tightly she might have believed she could keep fate from slipping. Grace knelt, hands slick with a color she had learned too young. "Dad," Sophie said, as if the word could weld. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered. "For everything and one thing." Sirens auditioned courage outside. The detective's voice turned the air into orders. Men who had rehearsed power forgot their lines. Victor ran and was caught easily, because a man whose life is only angles forgets that straight lines are faster. Richard's last gift was uncomplicated. He made himself a wall. The daughters never forgot, neither did Grace. Neither did Melissa, who for a long time afterward touched her child's hair and thought a man can die and still raise a child every day. At the funeral, the flowers smelled expensive and insufficient. The room filled with people who knew Richard as a donor, a leader, a negotiator. Very few knew the man who had changed the diaper of a dream and bought a crib that never held anyone. Grace stood near the back, where humility likes the light best. The daughters moved toward her with faces that had learned. Lena said thank you, as if the words were heavier than the coffin. Sophie said nothing. Some grief uses vowels, some uses gravity. Melissa, swollen with near birth, placed a hand on the casket and said, "We forgive you." It was not a pardon. It was an inheritance she wanted her child to hold. The will was a mess because hearts rarely write clean documents. Lawyers calibrated disappointment. The house became a contested pronoun. The sister's grandmother entered like a weather pattern that had been waiting to ruin a picnic, producing papers and signatures that favored everything but mercy. The lines were pretty. The ink was not. When people decide to take your home, they begin by taking your time. Grace did not fight every battle. Illness chose for her fever and the old injury, conspiring to remind her of limits. She left with a small envelope of money less than a future, more than nothing, and a mother's address written in careful pen. Melissa watched from the doorway, one hand on the frame, one on her stomach, and said, "Come back when you can bear it." Grace nodded and walked away with a suitcase that complained about stairs. Recovery is not triumphant. It is domestic. Back in a modest apartment near the edge of town, another river, Grace learned the rhythm of cheap kettles and stubborn windows. Her mother's hands had become maps of the work they had done in her absence. They didn't talk about Tennessee. They fed each other memories with less salt. When the fever broke, Grace went looking for work. Factories still hire women who know how to show up. She wore the only blazer that hadn't learned to lie and pressed a smile across it like an iron. On the way to the interview, a brick had fallen from a construction site and lay in the middle of the sidewalk where the old and the distracted would surely meet it. Grace bent, body complaining, leg remembering, and lifted the brick to the side. She smoothed the dust as if the path were a child's hair. Then she kept walking. The interview began late. The room had glass in it, and the kind of air that doesn't move until it's told. A young executive entered with a laptop and a frown that tried to be neutral. He looked like somebody's son who had learned Excel before grief. "I'm Evan Cole," he said, CEO. "We're small, growing. Why us?" I need to learn usefulness again, Grace said simply. He paused, as if the sentence had a door he hadn't noticed. On my way in, he said, I saw you move a brick off the walkway. It wasn't ours. You didn't know I could see you. Grace smiled, nearly apologetic. It was in the way. Of whom? Anyone. He closed the laptop. We can teach skills, he said. We can't teach that. She started Monday. Work was boxes and scans and small decisions. She did not resent them. She wrapped packages like blessings. She labeled things clearly, because confusion is a violence. When she made tea, she made enough for whoever walked in next. The warehouse learned her name the way kind places learn songs by humming. Melissa called one evening. The baby had arrived, a boy, red and furious at the news of air. She had named him James because she liked the way the consonant began and ended, like a promise. I'm leaving the house, Melissa said. Too many ghosts. I'd rather raise him where the floor belongs to us. Come by, Grace said. My mother misses other women's gossip. When they met, they didn't perform. Grace held James and felt the gravity of choices she hadn't made and responsibilities she had agreed to anyway. Melissa sat with her hands still and said, I'm afraid of repeating myself. We all are. Grace answered, That's why we practice being different. The sisters tried again to summon their grandmother's weather. The courts yawned. Papers that once terrified now required signatures from people whose hands were gone. Grief, it turned out, had done subtle arithmetic. Their hunger for possession no longer found enough to eat. Months layered themselves into something like a life. On Saturdays, Grace and her mother bought fruit that bruised easily and treated it gently. On Sundays, Melissa visited with James and a stack of questions about diapers and men who text at odd hours. They laughed sometimes in a way that did not betray the dead. When autumn arrived, the warehouse's loading dock framed the sky in orange and apology. Evan stood beside Grace after shift and said, Carefully, you're good at seeing what's in the way. It's an old hobby. She smiled. I could use that up front. He said, Operations, more hours, better pay. She thought of the brick. She thought of the staircase. She thought of a white dress folded into the back of a drawer in a city that no longer owned her. Okay, she said. And in that small word was the architecture of a return at home. She opened a box she had not opened since leaving Richard's house. Inside lay the dress white once, torn forever. She touched the fabric the way one touches the hand of a person in a coma gently. Knowing memory can hear. She didn't throw it away. She didn't keep it out. She placed it back and wrote on a card, I am not the worst thing that happened to me. She slid the card on top and closed the lid. Some evenings, when the rain remembered how to come soft, she sat by the window the way she had in Tennessee and in Austin and in waiting rooms that didn't know her name. She drank tea and counted the lights in other people's homes. She wondered about the lives inside them, who was failing, who was forgiving, who was just now learning that mercy is not the same thing as permission. On a night like that, Melissa sent a photo, James asleep, mouth open, full trust propped against a shoulder that had learned not to drop anything. Thank you. The text read. It did not specify for what. Grace looked at the street below, clear, briefly, of obstacles, and felt the quiet arrive like a friend who doesn't ask to be entertained. If there is a moral, she thought, it is not that sin ruins everything. It is that some people will pay for what they break, and some will pay for what they save, and most of us will pay for both. The world keeps its accounts strangely. What looks like loss becomes inventory for a later kindness. What looks like victory turns out to be debt. She turned off the lamp. The dark was kind tonight, and somewhere deep inside, where even prayer hesitates, a sentence finished itself and did not ask to be spoken aloud. We are more than the worst rooms we have been asked to survive. Not every sin ends in darkness. Some end in quiet rooms, where people learn to live gently with what they've done and with what was done to them. If tonight's story stayed with you, take a deep breath and stay close. Subscribe to Calm Mind Journal, where every night we share stories of love, loss, and the quiet redemption found in being human.